and then I'll hand over to yourself, Graham, and then over to Paul. Oh, no. Be helpful if I shared my screen. There we go. Okay, so welcome to the March Azure Microsoft Cloud South Coast User Group session for 2021. We've picked the perfect day as it's same day as the Ignite conference 2021, the second half of 2020, depending on which way you want to look at it. Today we're joined by Graham and Paul, both cloud solution architects in their specific areas. Graham will be taking us through Azure Synapse. Is that the right pronunciation? I think so. Synapse, and Azure Purview as well. And then we've got Paul, excuse me, who later on afterwards, who will take us through Azure Sentinel and give us Azure Sentinel and give us an overview of that. Just so everybody's aware, we've got another 3 sessions coming up. One in the 6th of April, on the 6th of April, and the second one on the 4th of May, and a third one on the 2nd of June around modern workplace power platform dynamics, as you can see. Today is sponsored by Mexa Solutions. I don't know if Simon's on or not. I don't believe he is. If not to worry.
I don't think he is.
Okay, cool.
I think he's in his hot shop sipping champagne again.
Right, okay, fair enough. Lastly, but not least, we've got the South Coast Summit as well, the 16th of October at the Aegeus Bowl, which is myself and Aaron's event. So hopefully we'll be able to see you there then. And I'll
Hello, can you hear me?
Wow, this is going well.
Have we lost Nathan, or who? Is that we can hear each other? Can we?
I can hear.
I can hear you.
Yeah, I can hear you. Yeah. Looks like we lost that. Yeah, looks like we lost. Yeah.
Well, I think Nathan was leading into me anyway. Aaron, is that right? I think.
Yeah, correct. Yeah.
Will I just pick up the baton here? Will I?
Yeah. If you got presenter.
Yep. So I'm just going to share my screen. Let me know if you can see our good friends at our PowerPoint.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, I can see that.
All right. Yep. All right. I'm just going to kick off. Aaron, I'll run till 5:30 and hand over to Paul, if that's okay.
Yeah, that'd be brilliant. Yeah, cheers. Thank you very much. And yeah, thank you very much for taking your time out this evening to present.
Pleasure. So I will try to come in at 5:30. Quite a few topics to discuss. Purview might be on the edge. We'll see how we go. So what I just wanted to cover was Azure Synapse Analytics, in particular, if time permitting, which may or may not be the case. I'll try to include a bit of Purview. So I'm a data and AI cloud solution architect for Microsoft, predominantly working in the financial services, but again, work across all industries as well. So I just wanted to give you an overview. I will try to break out of the slides and actually show you the interface. But first, I just wanted to give you maybe a baseline as to what Synapse is, because if I'm honest, it sometimes takes a bit of explaining or a bit of understanding, because it actually is many things in one. So let me just explain. So hopefully what you see here are basically the 4 pillars, and we're kind of think of it in the data world now, in the data realm, and we're an enterprise, we're ingesting data, multiple data sources, structured, unstructured. And we're trying to figure out, for example, how do we build our data platform? How do we build the pipeline structures around this? So these are pillars that you probably have seen in various maybe white papers, Gartner, etc. How we often try to portray the different steps in the life cycle of the data, from the raw ingest on the left-hand side there, right through to the curation, reporting, consumption, analytics, applications on the right-hand side. So just to sort of the way we often position it, and each of those pillars represent different disciplines, and behind those disciplines are often different services. So for example, Some of these may or may not be familiar, some of these terms, but behind each of these pillars, so for example, starting from the left, ingest, we have lots of different tools, services, capabilities, both ours, Microsoft's, and partners as well. So we ingest data. Data Factory is mainly seen as a sort of, let's say, cloud native data ingestion, scheduling, orchestration, monitoring solution. So that's kind of the, let's say, default solution. The storing of the data, perhaps once upon a time it was Blob, but we've sort of Data Lake is, if you like, has superseded Blob, or is built on top of Blob. But Data Lake store is often where we store the enterprise data. In a kind of, think of it as a folder structure, and there's obviously, we'd always recommend some best practices, because you don't want to store your data in one big bucket, so to speak, or container. But generally, that's how most customers would operate. And by the way, the data lake can be logical. You could actually have many physical servers behind that. And then we get into, say, prep and train. And what we mean by that is you may do some cleansing, you may do some data quality, you may do some transformations, joining, merges, all these classic ETL, ELT type techniques. And again, there are many, many engines, and certainly with the cloud, with Azure, you get many options, be they Spark, stored procedures, traditional SQL, Python, etc. I'm just going to put in, for example, Data Factory in there as well, because Data Factory also brings a, let's say, a low code mechanism to do transformation. It can also call, let's say, pro code, things like Spark, like Databricks, for example. It can also call those engines, but that's what you get. You get the flexibility, whether you're bringing SSIS packages, stored procedures, you want to embrace Spark or Python. Basically, you can bring all of that knowledge, investment to Azure, and using something like Data Factory, it can orchestrate all of those, let's say, hybrid pipelines. And on the right-hand side there, we have, let's say, the database engines, or let's say data stores. Again, we're going to focus on Synapse Analytics, but there are many. You're probably familiar with the SQL family, but we have things like Cosmos DB as well. And on the right-hand side, you would often serve what you've built, what you've curated, transformed to things like your BI solutions, obviously Power BI generally in our universe, but there are other consumption patterns, applications, AI, ML use cases as well. So the reason we kind of talk around these kind of pillars and the different solutions is it can lead to some confusion, or it can lead to quite a lot of integration effort to build this out, because you're knitting together different solutions, obviously trying to do it in a secure manner using things like managed identities, for example, for security best practices. So what Microsoft have tried to achieve is try to simplify this and make it one screen, one, if you like, one user experience that serves different personas, be you data scientist, data engineer, business analyst, DevOps. You could use the same solution. And basically that's where we get to Synapse, Azure Synapse Analytics, or Azure Synapse Studio is the UI. And basically that houses lots of these different services, the ones I've highlighted there. They're all within the same screen, within one same experience. And as I said, the aim is to make that, let's say, the user experience, the provisioning, the managing, the security orchestrations, to make that a lot easier. So you're not having to pass work between different teams or different divisions. You can, from a, let's say, separation of duties point of view, but it's not required from a technology point of view. So we're trying to make that a lot easier to basically get faster time to value, because the value is on the right-hand side there, applying your data to AI, ML, analytics, making decisions, grinding the data through the pipelines from the left to the right. You want to accelerate that. And that's really what this experience is about. So the next thing I just want to get onto before I maybe break out into a demo mode is I just wanted to get across maybe some of the, let's say, some of the engines and some of the patterns here, because again, maybe how I positioned it previously, sometimes we need to get into the next level of detail. So just say, for example, we ingest data on the left-hand side, and again, we're using Data Factory. There are other solutions and services, but we'll default to that. Because what you're seeing here now is going to be what you get inside Synapse. So what you then do is basically land the data in your data lake. And again, you can see all the various formats there. And again, it's typical in an enterprise to have lots of different different file formats, be they structured, CSVs, text. A lot more are using things like Parquet, which are kind of very much synonymous with Spark. But what we can also see is a lot of customers will have a lot of data lakes or Azure blobs. They may have transactional systems like Cosmos or SQL databases. And what we're trying to do is ease the, let's say, consumption of that data. If that data needs to, for example, remain where it is, we want to make it easier to get access to it. So let's say the traditional model that we've had since 2016 with SQL DW, as was Azure SQL DW, which, by the way, is built upon SQL Server. Basically, what you did was you tended to take the data from your, let's say, staging layer, landing zone layer, as it was often called. You would do some transformations and put it inside a database, like, for example, SQL DW. Again, you can do that pattern. That's totally valid. Nothing wrong with that. There are some other patterns that you can actually use something called external tables, or those of you who know SQL, it's basically polybase. So what you can have is you can have a little, if you like, extension or stub that you're calling a flat file like a CSV. But actually it looks to a user or a SQL user like a table like any other. So that's using external tables, which is quite clever, and it just means that flat files can look like, or many flat files can just look like a standard table. So that is kind of the, let's say, paradigm of old, and again, nothing wrong with that. It still applies today, I should say. It's still, perfectly, let's say, legitimate, and again, I would say, a huge percentage of analytics reporting, data processing still uses that pattern. But what Synapse adds is it adds these extra engines. So for example, you have a Spark on-demand engine. So again, what the Spark on-demand engine does, it basically is obviously built on Apache Spark. But what it can do is it brings all of the Python, Scala, all of the various, let's say, Spark languages. You can use those via notebooks inside the Synapse Studio here. But what you can do is with that Spark on-demand engine, you can basically analyze the data. You can process it, use things like Spark SQL. You can build machine learning models, basically exploit the power of the Spark-based languages. And again, that is an on-demand engine. So basically, it's, if you like, you can define how large, how to auto-scale. You can define how small, how large it can grow, etc. So again, it's more of an on-demand model as to the other model, which the one above it, the SQL DW. That is a provision model that you would provision an amount of compute, and basically you pay for what you provision. Whereas the models below are more on-demand type capabilities. So we also have a SQL on-demand engine. And again, the idea is that should you need to access the data on your storage level, and again, CSVs, Parquets, etc., the idea is that you don't have to ingest them. They don't have to go through a processing cycle. You can literally, and I'll show you, right-click, and then it can actually generate the code for you, and actually you can burst into the query. So that's quite powerful, that irrespective of where your data is, you can get access to it very quickly. And again, to do a lot of these things manually, for example, with Parquet files, it can be quite cumbersome to get to process them or try to build pipelines or build queries. We're trying to eliminate that hassle, which I'll show you shortly. And also what we believe is very powerful is that we have Power BI built into the experience as well. So again, Power BI, kind of the, let's say, industry leader for business insight, business intelligence, and baked into the experience you get at Power BI screen, which you can link to your workspace. So again, you get the entire life cycle of the data here, from ingestion on the left-hand side, right through to visualizing it. And also you can use the Azure ML workspace, which think of Azure ML workspace and think of it as enterprise ML operations. So it can help you not just do machine learning scenarios, but doing things like deploying it. So for example, you build a model in your Spark on-demand engine, and what you can do is you can link it to your ML workspace, and then that can deploy it into a container, into a Kubernetes cluster or Azure container instance as well. So again, it tries to abstract the pain of having to do that manually in Kubernetes, which is non-trivial. But again, it's just tried to, in a series of clicks and through automation, that can happen automatically. So that's all within the one screen. I've got 9 minutes to try to break out of this and show you some of the interface. So I just wanted to get across some of the, let's say, the capabilities and engines there. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to stop presenting for a second, and I'll share my screen again, and actually we'll get into the Synapse Studio. Any questions while I'm toggling between screens here?
There's no comments so far, but I wouldn't worry about stopping dead on the hour on 1/2 past the hour.
Oh, but it's Mr. Collins. I don't want to steal his thunder, his sentinel thunder. All right, let me just find my. I think it should be. Can you see my screen?
Yeah.
Okay. So here we have. So this is a Synapse Studio, the UI. Obviously, you can see it's via the portal. I just want to get across a couple of points here. I'm literally all I'm going to be able to do in the time I have is just show you the interface and some of the capabilities, not as much as I'd love to drill into it. One thing that's pretty cool, by the way, there's literally 6 on the left-hand side, 6, if you like, blades or panels here. I'm just going to walk you through maybe not all of them, but some of them. The Learn one is quite cool because what you can do, by the way, is click into the gallery. And what you get access to within literally 2 clicks is going to bring up a gallery. These are all public data sets, obviously lots of COVID. But what you can do is you can just click on one of those. If I go to continue here, what it does in a series of, and that's giving me a preview, but what I could do is I could just click the add data set button and it adds it into my workspace and I have access to it straight away. And this is real data, by the way. It's just publicly available in Azure, so you can literally pull it into your workspace. So again, it's quite rich. To get up and running, it takes seconds because you have all of these data sets. We got lots of notebooks, we got lots of SQL pipelines, etc. You're up and running in seconds. And again, that's kind of quite a powerful, I think, capability here. So let me just come out of that. So what I'm going to do is maybe just quickly show you the manage screen. I'm just on the left-hand side. The reason I just want to show you this is very familiar to anyone who knows Azure Data Factory. I won't make that assumption that everyone does. But what you can do is you can basically define links to all the other Azure services. Actually, not just Azure services, but because this is Data Factory, which has got 90 connectors, you can connect outside of Azure as well. So we've lots of on-premise, other clouds, online services connectors as well. But what you can see in here, I've got, for example, a Power BI workspace connection, a Cosmos DB connection. The idea is that you would define the universe of your data, which, as I said, could be potentially all of your enterprise data could be defined in here, which means you have access. Now, obviously, the access is governed and controlled and security rules apply. But from a technology point of view, you can access that data. Little shout out to Git configuration. So everything you've seen in here is also hooked up to GitHub. So the next thing I just wanted to get across was, so while I'm in the kind of management screen here, you'll see on the left-hand side, we have these various pools. So we have, and again, this, if you cast your mind back to that slide, so we have the concept of SQL pools, and again, you can have one or many. And by the way, I think the reason you may have many is you may have different teams with different, let's say, use cases or concurrency requirements, SLAs. They could have different pools, if you like. You can also scale up and scale down. These pools can be different sizes. We also have the Apache Spark pools, and again, and these are, think of these as just pure engines. These are compute engines because the storage sits in the data lakes and the data sources. It just gives you that capability should you need to sort of service users. That's really what these pools are about. But you have control to decide how big or how small these clusters grow, these compute engines are. So that's the kind of manage, and you probably see purviews in there as well. What I'll do now is just go to the data sort of panel on the left-hand side. So in the data panel here, you'll see we have the concept of my workspaces. So again, the workspace is databases as databases as we know and love. So this is my provisioned, let's say SQL type SQL DW of old, but it's what we call a dedicated provisioned database. So you can see there's tables, and by the way, this looks no different to probably what you're used to in tools like Management Studio. So basically what you have is you have your series of tables, and one second here while my screen's refreshing. Basically what we have is we have tables, and I just wanted to point out we have the concept of external tables as well. And as I said, mentioned before, these external tables, these are actually pointing to files. Even though it looks like, if I do a select here, it looks like looks no different to a SQL table. It's actually a file under the covers. So again, it just means that that gives you the option to, for example, SQL users can query flat files, even though they don't need to understand what the format is. It just gives them the power. And by the way, you've seen there, it's no similar to SSMS. It's generated the code for me. It's generated the SQL. So the reason that's important is when we get into, if I just switch into the linked data sources, and again, to tie you back here on the left-hand side, what you're seeing is these are some of my data environments: blobs, Cosmos, Data Lake. But this could be your entire, this could be hundreds of services, right? That you know, it just means that you have the potential to access all of the data in your enterprise. So what I wanted to show here is what you're looking at here. This is actually a data lake. So it's just, think of it as a folder structure with, you know, possibly potentially petabytes of data. I'm just going to go into a particular folder here. And in this folder, what you'll see is there are multiple files of different file formats. So you can see I've got a JSON, I got a CSV. And this is really one of the key, I think, values of using Synapse. So what I can do is I can right click on any of those files. I could do something like select SQL script, and I can just, it basically can automatically generate the code for me. And again, this is quite powerful because to do that, you can see the code is generated behind the scenes. It's quite, let's say, verbose. It'd be quite a task to do that manually. But that's what you get with the beauty of getting, and it's just return the results there. Irrespective of your file formats, all of the major things like CSV, JSONs, Parquets, all of those different file formats, you can just need to right click and it'll, as I said, generate the code for you. The other thing that's quite valuable as well is if I right click on these Parquet files, let me just tick a for them. If I right click, I can go to new notebook and you can see it says load to data frame. So what that is doing is behind the scenes, it's now building some Spark code for me. And again, these are 4 files, but imagine if you've hundreds, and imagine if you've folders and subfolders, and this can all again be done using clicks or using things like wildcards to make it a lot easier. I'm actually going to select a Spark pool. So you may have noticed up on the right-hand side here, I have the concept here of a drop down for my language. So, and you can see I've now switched, whereas before everything was SQL. I have the option to run different engines: PySpark, Spark Scala, .NET, Spark SQL. And basically I select I've only one Spark engine here that's going to run against, and I'm going to hit the run all. So by the way, those of you who are familiar with Spark, there may be a bit of a penalty here because I may not have primed my cluster. But basically, it will run, and basically it'll run that code for me. But again, the key is that this is auto-generated. That rather than doing this manually, just by virtue of having Synapse, it's auto-generating that code, and you can see it's starting up with a Spark session. And again, it's going to generate that data frame. And once you build a data frame, you can again do all sorts of analytics, ML, Spark SQL, whatever. Again, whatever your requirement is. So that's a really quick, I think, run through of while that Spark is running, while that is taking place. I just wanted to also point you to another concept by the Cosmos. So you may or may not be familiar with Cosmos. It is one of our cloud enterprise data stores. But what it also is often used for, it's often used as a transactional data store. So what we have in here, we have something called Cosmos DB Link, where what you can do is through Synapse, and think of Synapse as an analytical engine. It can actually query the transactional engine that is Cosmos without having impact on the transactional engine, which means you can get very near to real-time analysis from your transactional environment from here within Cosmos. So there's a bit of, let's say there's a bit of integration going on behind the scenes between Synapse and Cosmos. But again, that's quite, it's quite, I think, a powerful capability that you're able to run analytics alongside your transactional environment. So again, just conscious I'm running out of time here. The only other thing a couple of things I just wanted to highlight was in the develop screen here on the left-hand side. I'm just going to go down to, you've probably seen, by the way, this is where you can keep all of your SQL scripts, but you'll also see here I've got Power BI. So again, just to show you that within the same experience, you can have your Power BI reports. You actually link your Power BI, you link to your Power BI workspace. So all of the Power BI assets you have, reports, etc., data sets, you can access them from here. So here you can see I've accessed my Power BI workspace, and it's the New York taxi driver data set. Again, that's all, I think it adds to the experience, because what you can do is you can build, as I said, build pipelines, you can do analytics, you can do ETL, ELT, and again, you can actually see the end product, if you like, through Power BI. And again, just on the left-hand side, this is actually, the pipeline icon is actually Data Factory. Again, if you're familiar with Data Factory, this is where you do your integration, build your pipelines. Again, there's some simple ones there. These are just doing copy type scenarios. But again, this is the whole Data Factory capability built within Synapse. That those of you who know it, it's the same Data Factory. It's just, as I said, you get access within the one experience. So that's a really quick run through, and I'm really not even going to get to Purview, other than I just want to say this what you're seeing here is Azure Purview, Purview preview. Ignore the Babylon statement. But basically what we have now is we do have a data catalog within Azure. It is public preview, and it is called Azure Purview. But basically what we have is the capability to, let me just do a search here, to store all of your enterprise assets that we've scanned. We have scanners, we have classifiers. You do have to point it to those environments, and basically it lands within your catalog, as you can see here, and you have the ability to do, you can see on the left-hand side, we filters, but we facets as well. We've classifiers, we've sensitivity labels, we've glossaries, we also have lineage. So again, I'm going to time out trying to even get close to talking about Purview, but again, maybe it's something we do at another date. And this, for example, is just a view of, this is a table, a SQL table. I'm just going to show you the schema, and there you can see it's fired certain classifiers. It's detected things like people's names, emails. There's over 100 classifiers out of the box, things like email, first name, last name, etc. But also you can customize those. So you can, if you have a certain vernacular in your organization or certain patterns, and you can train and define your classifiers to identify those. And we also capture things like lineage. So there you can see the evolution, if you like, of the various fields in that particular table. So only 3 minutes over. I haven't cut too much into my esteemed colleague. Any questions before I hand over? By the way, I'm covering like 2 or 3 careers in one, so I just apologize for the brevity. But again, at another date we can get into more detail, because we're getting into, there's many topics there within one. No, job done.
No, I don't think there's any questions come in from my perspective. Thank you very much. That was really interesting to kind of see that from an overview point of view and understand it a little bit further. There's definitely some time that I could spend there. Yeah, thank you very much. I really appreciate that, Graham.
Pleasure.
So onwards to Paul to talk about Azure Sentinel then. So Paul, it's over to you.
Cheers, thank you very much. Right, so while I play around with the presentation things, I've got quite a large slide deck, but what I'm going to do is, can I just check whether I've got it the right way around? Can you see my presenter view, or can you see the?
I can just see yourself and Graham as well at the moment. That's all I can see.
Okay. Hang on. Let's see. Hang on. Yes. Let's go screen 1. Right. Okay. How are we doing now?
So just loading, I think. For me, anyway. Aaron, is that
It's a
cool
long
for you? Or?
It's a long way from Yorkshire.
It takes a while, doesn't it?
I've got a black screen.
Yeah, that's all I'm seeing at the moment.
All right. Okay. Let's kill that and just try again. Apologies. Try resharing. Right. Okay. How are we doing now? Anything down the line?
Yep. Why Sentinel?
Right. So we've got just the slide rather than the presentation view.
Right.
Yeah.
Cool. Right. Okay. So this is part of a much larger deck that I will PDF and share at the end of this. But I like that because we're kind of concise on time. We'll just kind of use this as a particular summary slide. Probably like Graham, I'll just go through the UI itself to have a look at it. So, Sentinel. Well, it's a couple of reasons primarily. Key thing is it's taking SIEM solutions away from their traditional space of being on-premise and on-premise driven, and there are limitations with that. And also it leads to, let's say, the administration overhead required to maintain and patch, etc., for that infrastructure, and thinking about storage, etc. So by moving them into the cloud, you obviously then have the benefit of actually being able to focus on what the system is trying to deliver, and basically your job being is looking at security incidents, security events, and identifying particular threats and protecting environments against that. So that first bullet point there about, the key thing here is there's no infrastructure set up, there's no maintenance. So I don't have to think about, what server OS I am, what patching I need to do in it, what version of a database I need to run, etc., etc., etc. It is really just delivered as a service, and as an organization, then people can generally just utilize it as they see fit and need. It will also scale. You also, much like I was saying, you don't need to think about the compute side of things, because the storage side of things, because that's taken care of behind the scenes with Azure itself. Like a lot of Azure services, it's a case of pay for what you use. More importantly, though, is how do I get my data in? And it's utilizing those pre-wired, connectors that are there. On release, I think there was somewhere in the region of about, 20 to 30 connectors. We're now up to something like 90 odd connectors, and the product team have committed to deliver in the region of another 100 by the end of this calendar year. So there's been explosive growth in native connectors, and bringing both native connectors from Microsoft solutions, but equally dealing with third-party solutions and devices, and seeing those as first party, and ensuring that the data is available there. And a majority of cases, that's really, really important. The other thing to think about, the data behind this, is it's both structured and unstructured, but we utilize a fairly standard log format. Everybody's probably familiar with the Windows event log. On the other side of the fence, with regards to Linux and Linux, Unix, network devices, etc., it's either Ceph or syslog devices, or log format. So it's obviously bringing all of that in. One of the key things about the platform as in and of itself is that it, on average, correctly, the ingestion is in the region of 10 petabytes a day. So that's an extreme amount of data that's coming into the Azure form that is then queryable. We can then run things like machine learning models over the top of it, or artificial intelligence. And also it's linked to the threat intelligence. Now, behind the scenes here, and this kind of links to that, those 3 bullet points on the bottom left, on the left-hand side, about the investment that Microsoft made in cybersecurity. But the final bullet point there is thinking about the threat signals. Where are all of those coming from? They're coming from Microsoft's own, managing our own platforms across the globe. This is also coming from, governmental, federal type organizations and third-party providers to feed in that threat signals and those threat intelligence data. And that is utilized across the whole of the Microsoft security stack, whether that be Sentinel in this particular case, or others. And in the next slide, I will just position where Sentinel sits in the bigger picture. With regards to taking that a little bit further forward, there is the option there to bring your own machine learning model. So if you're familiar with Jupyter notebooks and Python and R, etc., you can build those additional, more complex, or even, you know, investigative type notebooks to run through that data set, and obviously then do some intelligent actions on the back of that. And essentially that's what the Microsoft SOC or CDOC actually do on a daily basis, is looking at those and looking what we can do there. And in actual fact, the team it's referred to as the Mystic team, which is the Microsoft Threat Intelligence Center. They actually produce a number of Python modules that actually can be utilized within those Jupyter notebooks to help through those investigations. Visualization is equally important, and that's just utilizing workbook type capability that's native within Azure itself, whether it be in Azure Monitor or in Sentinel or Log Analytics, if you're familiar with any of those services. The other part of all of this is also being able to visualize a potential attack. And that is essentially looking at the integration between a number of different data sources, regardless of whether they're native Microsoft or third party. It's building that view of the data, the signals, the correlation, the relationship between them, any sort of interdependencies, etc., identifying those. So as an analyst, you can essentially track what that kill chain could potentially look like, even though the data is coming from multiple different sources. Bullet point, the last two bullet points there is, you know, multi-cloud. It's not just Azure. In fact, you can link it through to AWS, GCP, and equally don't dismiss on-prem. It's just as important, or even hosted data centers. Wherever your environments live, you can utilize Sentinel to as a management team solution on top of that. The other capability, which I'll talk about a little bit further on, is the SOAR capability, or the orchestrated and automated response. So what do you do, or what can you do in an event of an incident? Some of that actions may be automatically remediated. Some of it may be more of a manual approach based on an analyst's view and knowledge and experience of what they might want to do in a particular scenario. And that actually leverages Azure Logic Apps as a way of running through those workflows, etc. So where does Sentinel sit in the overall picture? Top down. So Sentinel sits at the top, providing the traditional SIEMs capability, albeit built in the cloud, native in the cloud, but also looking at the SOAR capability. So again, utilizing Logic Apps to identify that and doing that as part of the orchestration element. As I mentioned, native connectors, building that integration between the wider Microsoft 365 Defender suite. So whether it be Azure Active Directory, Defender for Identity, or Cloud App Security, Endpoint, Ceph, and Syslog, as I've already mentioned, and looking at, across the board, whether you're looking at individual identities, endpoints, your data and email, or even those other cloud applications. And obviously with Cloud App Security, that expands again beyond what natively within the Microsoft stack. Then you look at that cloud and hybrid scenario, and this is where Azure Security Center fits into it. And this is a common question we get between, what's the difference between Security Center and Sentinel? Security Center is there as a cloud workload protection platform, or essentially it's, to boil it down and maybe do it a little bit of a disservice, it's about the security posture of resources that are in Azure and on, in a hybrid scenario, and equally extending that beyond the traditional virtual machines or physical servers, but also looking at, the services that are in Azure, or even more recently with the IoT side of things with the CyberX acquisition that Microsoft made. At the bottom here, we also talk about, and I kind of alluded to this, is the intelligent security graph. And that's essentially, the piece in there where all of these threat signals are enabled and identified and effectively consumed by all of these services. So that is the piece that, where all the data is and where the data lives. Third-party data sources, and what you find there is literally just a selection of the common scenarios that you find, or common partners that we find in there. So whether it be Palo Altos, your Cisco's, your Barracudas, your F5s, Qualys for vulnerability assessment. All of those sort of things are there natively out of the box. When we talk about the connectors, and I'll show this in a few minutes when I look at the UI, is they come with a configuration element. How do I get the data in? The rules that I will utilize then to build or analyze the data as it comes in to then potentially trigger an incident. And the visualization element is workbooks, and that is taking that data, running the queries, and actually presenting it in a way that's actually more consumable from a human's perspective. Okay, so thinking about move my mouse. Apologies. Couple of things I want to add in. Common question that comes up is, right, this is great, but where can I learn more about it? So from a training perspective, there are a number of webinars and seminars that you can actually look at with some links here. There's the Sentinel Ninja training. This is kind of a level 100 training. Level 400 training, apology. It starts you at the very basics of where do you start? How do I get it provisioned? How do I get the data enabled? Building it up through to building custom queries, looking at how do I do my threat hunting, moving on then into the sort of the Jupyter Notebook piece I mentioned earlier. Number of different learning paths. So again, on MS Docs, you got through the learn, you can start to look at the core capabilities, basic architecture, and how to get familiar with it. But talking about where we were, what's happening today. In fact, this was announced earlier today. There's actually 4 new certifications that have been announced to sort of close that the gap that's there from a security skills perspective. Now, whether you're going to be running and operating something like Sentinel, for example, then the certified security ops analyst certification might be for you. But then if you're dealing with more on the M365 side of the portfolio, you might want to look at things like the information protection or even the identity and access and the security and compliance and identity fundamentals, and kind of build up there from the ground up. So that's a useful addition to the sort of the training material that we've got. A couple of things that I want to just finish on before I move to the UI itself. And this is a scenario that comes up very often. When you talk about SIEM solutions, organizations by themselves will think about, I need a SIEM solution, therefore I will deploy it, I'll operate it, I'll manage it, etc. But what about if you've got a scenario where, as an organization, you've got multiple, maybe disparate businesses that might have, they want to have the elements of their own autonomy, and they want you from an operations perspective, but actually from a security perspective, you want to centralize all of that. Or maybe you're a partner that wants to deliver an as an MSSP. Here's where you can utilize, Azure Lighthouse. Azure Lighthouse is effectively a free service, overlay service, if you want to call it that you can utilize with Azure Sentinel, Azure Log Analytics, Security Center, or even Azure Policy to actually give you a view across both multiple tenants, or in the case of Azure Sentinel, multiple Azure Sentinel environments. So if you're in a scenario where you're thinking about, maybe I want to do, provide MSSP type services, then you have that capability where within the Azure portal, you have a delegated right to your, to a customer's tenant, and therefore then you have the right permissions to actually, maintain and manage and operate that environment through the use of Azure Lighthouse. So finally, I'm not going to go through all of these, but again, I've got a whole bunch of more links about, where you can use the key element in here is probably the third bullet point there in that useful links is Azure Sentinel utilizes a query language called Custom Query Language, or KQL. It is very, I'll say SQL-like in the way that it's structured. However, it is very, very powerful in how what you can do with it, whether it be cross table joins, whether it be cross workspaces, etc. You have the capability to do that. And the cool thing about this is that there is actually a free course on Pluralsight. It's about 4 to 5 hours, but it is well worth investing the time. So if this is an area you want to look at, then I'd certainly recommend looking at that. So, and there's some extra links on that. So while I just swap around this time, so let me just stop sharing, do what Graham did a little bit earlier, and let me share. Right. Bear with me a second. Okay, now hopefully this comes through and you don't have a black screen. So could somebody possibly give me a visual check, please?
It's thinking about it, Paul. Still, yeah, we're good.
Right. Okay. So if you're familiar with the Azure portal, you know, you can get to Sentinel by typing in Sentinel, and I've done a recent search already. So once you get to the Azure Sentinel part of this, you can go through the process of either creating a new Sentinel environment, which in effect relies on a log analytics workspace to store your data. So when we build up that picture, we start with the Azure Sentinel we start with the log analytics workspace. We then attach Sentinel to that, and then after that, it's down to the actual configuration of Sentinel itself. So what you end up finding is that actually the provisioning part of it is done in about 10 or 15 minutes. Where it takes a little bit longer is about the data connections, maybe looking at your RBAC model, etc. But essentially, you know, what come in and you effectively get to this overview screen. Now, I tend to start with the news and guides, and the reason for that is not because it's you know, a bit cheesy or anything like that, but actually there's quite useful information here. If you scroll all the way to the bottom, there's actually a link to the Ninja training that I was mentioning earlier. But also what the product team are doing is actually utilizing it as a way to advertise latest things that we've put in there. Yes, there's the, you know, the tech community blog site that's available that does a lot of these, but equally, if you haven't familiar with that and you've not gone there for a while, chances are you can get to see what you need to see from the news and guides here. And it's really, really useful places. Configuration starts with data connectors, and I mentioned that there's like 90 odd of them here. Now, I will mention that some of these connectors are in preview. All that means is that some of the capability they've been recently announced, and they've been made available purely on the basis that we're now getting to that point where we're looking at scale testing. You know, so and then the next question is generally, when's it going to be available? The answer is when it's ready is the simple. I know it's a bit of a flippant answer, but that's generally the case. What I've found in the past is that I will be demoing one day and I'll have a connector that's in preview, and the following day it's then gone into general availability. Although that said, the product team are trying to do them more in semesters, so in sort of quarterly and time frames where they will release a few and get them into, you know, out of preview and into be generally available at the same time if they can. As you can see, there's you know, from a provider's perspective, it's not just Microsoft. We have a plethora of third parties in there, and this list is going to grow. And this is the list I was referring to earlier, whereby actually, you know, they've committed to delivering so much more. I'm just going to pick up on one at the moment, so I'll pick up on the Azure Active Directory. I mentioned about the connector page. So over here on the right-hand side, on this kind of you know, summary screen, you basically see what the data flow is like inbound, and based on the criteria or category of log that we're bringing in. So you can see from AAD's perspective, we're bringing in sign-in logs, audit logs, and the other ones that we've enabled in there with maybe the non-interactive logins and sign-ins, etc. What you will also note as part of these is that there's also related content. The related content is coming back to what I was mentioning earlier. There's the workbooks for visualization. There's some sample queries. They're not a complete list, but they're a good place to start. The other part of it, which is probably the most important part, is the analytic rule templates. Those are the out-of-the-box rules that you can enable to start interrogating and analyzing the security data that's coming into your particular environment. And those are based on the KQL. So if I click through on that particular, we can see the list that's down here, and it's I'll just let it come through and give it a moment. But essentially, what you have with these analytic rules is that if we look at this one here, for example, which is the MFA disabled for a user, that could be based on, you know, that we want to identify that. If we've enabled MFA across the board, we want to identify and in effect alert on the basis that maybe it's been disabled for a particular user. Is that an indicator of credential access? It may or may not be, but that's the rule that we will utilize to actually interrogate the data that's coming from AAD to identify that particular scenario. When those rules are enabled and when the criteria is met, it will then, I just cancel that, it will appear in the incidents node. The incidents is a case of the rule has been met, and we will now identify. So if I'm the a SOC analyst, this is probably where I'm going to spend my day, is going through these, and I could individual alerts in and of by themselves. So if I pick on this one about potential password spray, I'm actually going to go straight to the view full details, just so it gives me a bit more information here. What you will see is there's a number of different data points on this particular view. We've got a description, we've got the evidence that we've got there, so we can see there's a number of events, the alert that's associated with it, when it was when it was updated, and when it was created. It will also identify any entities that are associated there. So thinking about a password spray, it's probably picking a list of user accounts. It's probably doing something like a dictionary search. Can it identify those? So, and what it's doing behind the scenes is picking up on those accounts and identifying and marking them. When you look at the detail over here on the right hand side, we can see severity, whatever else. The important thing that I want to highlight is, and I mentioned this a little bit earlier, is the view the playbooks shortcut that's there. That would take me to the list of playbooks that are logic app playbooks that evoke in reaction to this particular incident. On the analytic rules, just to double back on the analytic rules, if I want to, I can add so it will automatically remediate a particular scenario. But we need to look at those and identify those up front and we'll move configuration. One thing I will mention as part of these is that each of these incidents will map, as you can see, the tactics here. It's looking at the MITRE ATT&CK framework. So when we think about both the, we're thinking of it on the basis of our hunt rules. So think of instances almost, I don't want to react, it is to a certain extent reactive, whereas the hunting side of it is I'm being proactive. I am looking for particular indicators. Now we do have a number of rules, again there's 200 odd of them in here, that are there that you can enable effectively to allow you to hunt through that data set. Very small minor point, but it's quite neat in a way, is that if I favorite any of those, what it does is when I come to this hunting view, it'll automatically run that particular query for me. So that's why I've got results here of this rare audit activity for initiated by a user. Again, I can go down, I can drill down into this, and if I was going to, it would literally take me down into the raw data in the log analytics workspace. And you can see at the top here, about the MITRE ATT&CK framework, how many of those rules are based on each of the individual tactics that are associated there. One thing I would say, just looking at time and thinking about this, is that it is always changing. So, we've got in the threat intelligence, you can bring your own threat intelligence. So if you're familiar with things like sticks and taxi data sources, for example, you can bring those in and supplement what is already there with your existing data sets. One thing that's also really, really useful is things like watch lists. Most of you will probably be familiar with the concept of VIP type users. Well, you can use it, or even, really important machines, quote unquote, is you can create those watch lists, and effectively based on that watch list, you can use it in a query and say, right, I want an eye out for any sort of data that's related to this particular, this group or this individual or, list of individuals within the data. So that's kind of really, really, really important. The last thing I'm going to show is kind of the side of things. So this is where we're starting to look at individual users within your tenant or tenants and what their interaction is. So I'm going to pick up on Chris here. And so what you can see, look at an individual user. What it's doing is it's not only giving me information about him as an individual, it's also giving me an idea of the events and alerts over time. And then further down here, I can actually look at each of the events that are associated with that that. So we can see maybe there's a suspicious granting permissions to an account, and it allows, so it gives me timeline, but then I can drill down into that, and I've done this now. So now what it's done is taken me down into the raw data behind all of this, and it will build a query and it'll return the results set. What's really cool here is that once the data comes back, I have the option to then create another rule off the back of that if appropriate. Actually, the customer is quite big on that. Apologies, it's taking a bit of time. I'm actually just going to go straight back because that's just taking a bit. Oh, there we go. That's come through, so we can see that is a suspicious activity. What I can do, and I didn't show this a little bit earlier, is if I want to, I can actually bookmark this. What that means is if I've looked at a particular result set, for example, and I think there's something else that it might be warrant somebody else having a look at it, by bookmarking it, I could then come back to the central UI. I can then go to hunting, and if I look at the bookmarks here, I can then look at that particular rule set. So what it means is that just because I'm looking at something and I may need a second opinion, by bookmarking it, somebody else can come along and therefore then can pick up on one of these, and you can see then a bit more of the detail, and they can start to analyze that and maybe do some additional work on it. What I will say, just as a final thing, looking at the time, and I'm running 2 minutes over now, is that there is a massive community behind all of this. Behind this view here is actually an Azure GitHub repo. And within the repo itself, what has been built, and this is a curated repo, is additional data connectors, additional detections, queries, whether they be hunting or exploration queries, playbooks, parsers. So if you're familiar with Sysmon, for example, you might want to parse the data before you send it in. So there's a wealth of knowledge and additional capability that you can bring into and sort of leverage as part of that, your Azure Central deployment. On that note, I will park it there. But any questions? But please feel free to ask them.
Hi, Paul. Thanks for going through that. Really interesting. I've actually got a question or two, if that's okay.
Fine. Yeah.
So why not? The first one that I've got is quite a generic question, really, and that's what are the most wanted connectors, as well as also what's kind of under development, what can we kind of see coming through in the future from a connector perspective?
Yeah, so the connectors themselves, it varies. So obviously from Microsoft's perspective, we're going to develop and add additional connectors or evolve the connectors that we have. So an example I'll give you, when we released the Office 365 one, for example, it had it had Exchange and SharePoint. And then they've added Teams to that. So the connectors always evolve. The biggest growth area in connectors is third parties. And that's because most organizations have utilize maybe best of breed type scenarios when they're thinking about how they're protecting their environments, whether it be at the perimeter or even internal to that. So that's where the area of focus is. And it varies. There's, most of the, shall I say, the major players are covered. But equally, if I was to look at Cisco as an example, we started out with the ASAs, but they've added more. So if you're familiar with Umbrella, for example, that's come in, and I think that particular connector is in preview. And that's how it'll evolve. It's mostly based on demand, but the bigger vendors will be, dealt with first. Another example I had earlier this week was, and I don't know if anybody's come across it, using 2FIN for sort of network policy management and orchestration. I've had 2 queries this week about that one in particular. So, talking to the product team themselves and say, right, what we want you to do is a feedback form. Let's fill in the feedback form. And then what they do is utilize that as kind of a prioritization of where to focus their energies. Because obviously, like a lot of places, they've got a finite amount of resources. And it's about, you've probably looked at these things on user voice, for example, where you've got, your vote up button. They do make a big difference about where they focus their energies.
Oh, that's good to know. Thanks for that. If there was one piece of advice that you would give when using Sentinel, what would it be?
2 things, probably. 1, look at your data retention, and 2, start to think about your long-term storage of it. The reason for that is most organizations when they run on-premise teams, they don't really think about that per se, because they just assume they'll just have, they'll work out the storage of the back end and what they're going to do with it. From a Sentinel perspective, there's a cost associated with retaining that data for any period of time up to 2 years. And that's where potentially it can become expensive. So looking at the longer term storage of that. So, this is where my role starts to blur a little bit into the area where Graham lives a lot of the time, is in starting to look at, things like data lakes. So that's probably the areas to think about when you're looking at Sentinel, is that the operational and using it is fine, but actually think about the longer term piece as well. So that would be when you think about the patterns.
Would that long-term piece kind of relate to what a company would determine to be a good time to keep data for, and like data retention and things like that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Exactly. So most patterns these days, that we're starting to see more from the conversation is coming up. We'd always say, initially would say, you can store it in the workspace up for 2 years, right? But beyond 2 years, if you needed to that, the option was stick it into an Azure storage account. That is fine. But where it becomes a challenge sometimes is then if you want to query that data, and just the way the queries are built. Yes, we can reference it, but actually the query becomes really complex because of the way the data is stored in the storage account. So what we're starting to see is that we're starting to use Azure Data Explorer as a kind of a way of doing that. So by taking the Sentinel data and storing it, say, in the workspace for 90 days, and actually doing a dual write into an ADX cluster, I could then write a query against the 90-day window, and then use the same query against the longer, maybe 2, 3, 4, 5 year window, using that. So that becomes a lot easier to do it. So that's where we're starting to see a lot more conversations about, is people want hot at 90 days is generally fine, but it's the hunting side of it, more the forensics that they want for longer term.
That's really interesting. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I can see where that could make a difference for, especially when, depending on the types of organizations you're dealing with, can make a big difference there.
Yeah, and I mean, if you think about, Graham and I work in the same team, so we're pretty much in finance and cap markets. And I like Graham, I kind of touch my toe in the other sectors as well. But you're right, is that certain organizations in certain sectors will have different views on how long they need to retain the data for, and it's therefore then what's the best way of doing it. And when you think about it, at the same time we want to make it efficient, both from an operational perspective, but also from a cost scenario. And that's then where, we're starting to look at how do we blend between, the technologies and the services. Yeah,
there's definitely always a trade-off when it comes to, long-term retention. You have to think about those storage technologies, which, as you quite rightly say, Graham, has a massive part in. So, yeah. Mm-hmm. I don't think there's any other. One of the other questions that I did have was around the visualization side of things. So going in and using Sentinel, you can see the visualization of things and attacks that are happening. Is that possible to view outside?
Do you mean the investigation graph where I can join all the dots or whatever else? No, that's internal to Sentinel, and that's because what it's did. That's where the internal. That's where the AI and the machine learning is working, because what it's doing is it's looking at that data set and it's joining the dots, to use the analogy, and keeping the relationship. So when you look at that investigation graph, if for example, where we had, when I looked at Jeff from a UEBA scenario, so if we'd identified a credential access, for example, against his account or other accounts, what you do from there is it then can either link to other alerts associated with that, or events linked to that again, so where it might have been used somewhere else. And that's, so the visualization element is as much to do with the data that's beneath it as opposed to what you see. It's just an easier way, because the queries that's built behind it is what brings it forward.
That makes sense. I don't think we've got any further questions apart from mine. Apologies about the start as well. My internet just seemed to absolutely decided to jump off a cliff for some reason. No idea as to why.
No worries.
No worries.
No, I don't think there's any further questions at all, to be honest with you. But thank you very much for taking the time to come and join us today, and present on the two topics. And yeah, it's been really interesting to kind of go through them and understand a little bit more. And I'm sure others have got some valuable insights as well. So thank you very much. Really appreciate it.
Pleasure.
You're great.
Thank
Right
you.
No
on.
very
problem
much.
at all.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you very much.
Cheers, everyone. Have a good evening.
Thank you. Have a
Yep.
good evening. Yep. Thank you.
Take care, everyone. Bye bye.
Thank you. Cheers.